Hi, everyone. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the history of sign language interpreting and interpreting in general. So, for example, the origin of interpreting would have started as soon as people were speaking different languages. How that would happen is as, population grew, then people started to live away from one another. And as that happens over time, people develop language, develop customs, develop their own culture. And so somebody from one uh, village or tribe or family might go and live with another group, and they would learn that language, those customs, and that culture, and then they would be able to communicate between those two groups, which would help facilitate uh, exchange of food or materials, goods. So this could happen from, tribe to tribe, family to family, village to village, etc. And this would have been going on ever since uh, groups were far enough apart from one another where they would have developed their own lifestyle, cultures, customs, and language. Now, in modern day time, in modern era, some will say that the modern day interpreting or simultaneous interpreting began or was solidified with the Nuremberg trials that took place in 1945 to 1949. And the languages that were used at the trials were English, French, Russian, and German. And the reason why this is noted, or what this is this is noted as the modern day beginnings of formal simultaneous interpreting, because these were the trials that took place related to the war. And so this would be like the United Nations type of interpreting, where you would have people operating from within these languages, conveying the information or the communication from language to language regarding these peoples in this trial. The formal beginnings of the profession of sign language interpreting in the United States begins with a workshop on interpreting that took place at a place called Ball State Teachers College in Muncie, Indiana. And this was in June 14th through 17th in 1964. And then this event is where the organization that is currently known as the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, or what we would call RID, that's where RID was conceived, is at this particular event at Ball State Teachers College, 1964. So keep that in mind. Those of you who are going to become interpreters, certified interpreters with RID, some of this historical data you do need to know. So I would tell you, in this case, know the date, June 14th through June 17th, 1964, and know the location, Ball State Teachers College in Muncie, Indiana, and know that they were there for a workshop on interpreting, and that was the origin of what is now known as the Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf. Prior to 1964, interpreters were typically family members of deaf people, clergy, right? People who led various churches, and friends. And at this point in time, before 1964, interpreters were typically not paid by businesses or organizations where they interpreted. Interpreters might have been offered a small amount of money or something like lunch by the deaf person to thank them, but there was really no formal payment from organizations or businesses at that point in time. Where interpreting became, where we started to see formal pay actually comes into play in 1965. And so there were several pieces of legislation that impacted the profession of interpreting. And the first one is the Rehabilitation Act of 1965, which identified sign language interpreters as a service for vocational rehabilitation clients. So this is the beginning of the first paid work. So VR clients were deaf people who went to vocational rehabilitation to have VR help them get work. And VR understood that to help the deaf person get work, the deaf person might need interpreters for job interviews and for job training. Later in 1973, the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, in Section 504, defined the services of interpreters again, and then what it stated was all agencies and institutions that received federal funds must be accessible. So instead of it just being vocational rehabilitation and their clients, every organization that received federal funds must become accessible. So that meant all of the federal government, and then that also meant lots of colleges and universities and other schools. If they were receiving federal funding, they needed to start providing sign language interpreters for their deaf clients. In 1975, we have the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, and that introduced mainstreaming, because what it did is it created the least restrictive environment, which that's a whole separate discussion for another time. But what that did is that meant that families could start to have their deaf child go to their local school district. Prior to this, most of the deaf kids would go off to a deaf school, a state-run deaf school. And so and it was a residential school for most of them as well, because if you didn't live in the area, you would go live at the school for the school year and you'd come home during the summers. So but when the Education for All Handicapped Children Act introduced the least restrictive environment, which meant that deaf kids could stay home, many families started to send their deaf child off to the local school district. Um, Again, if you want to sit back and think about it, you'll spend some time wondering whether or not it was good to have the deaf kid at home with their families who didn't know sign language, who never did learn sign language, or if it would have been better for the kids to continue to go off to the state school for the deaf where they used sign language and they could interact with, they would have friends, and teachers and such who used sign language with them, so they would get communication all day long, where at home they might not have an interpreter, but it might be a very unqualified interpreter, and then when they go home after school, then there's no one to talk to. In any case, mainstreaming started a lot of opportunities for interpreters to get paid throughout the United States. Lots of opportunities, and that exists to this day. A next major piece of legislation is the Americans with Disabilities Act. That was in 1990, and that also meant now that private businesses of a certain size, but private businesses essentially have to make their organization, their business, accessible as well. So we started off in 1965 with it being deaf clients of vocational rehabilitation. And so VR was the first organization that was formally paying for interpreting services. And then we took it to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, which says that essentially businesses, government, private businesses, all must provide, must be accessible, and accessibility to deaf people means interpreters.